I want to introduce our incredible panel moderator, Dr. Curry. He is an associate professor in the political science department. He received his PhD from Western Michigan University in 2012. His primary area of research examines how the methods of selection and retention used to staff state courts of last resort interact with judicial behavior. His work has been published in the Journal of Politics, PS Political Science and Politics, among many others. Dr. Curry teaches undergraduate classes in constitutional law, judicial politics, and research methods, as well as graduate courses. I'll also introduce our incredible panelist, Dr. Pineda, who is an associate professor in the Department of Communication and currently serves as director of the Sam Donaldson Center for Communication Studies. Dr. Pineda's research and teaching interests focus on politics, leadership, media, popular culture, and Latinidad. His research has appeared in a number of communication journals, including Text and Performance Quarterly, Argumentation and Advocacy, and many more. Robert Moore has been a journalist for 37 years, most of it in El Paso. Currently, he is president and CEO of El Paso Matters, a nonprofit news organization he founded in 2019. This year, Moore was a recipient of the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award for work that showed that the Border Patrol ignored the worsening condition of a 16-year-old boy who later died of the flu in his cell. He was also part of a Washington Post team that was a Pulitzer Prize finalist for coverage of the mass shootings in El Paso and Dayton, Ohio. In 2013, he was presented the Benjamin C. Bradley Editor of the Year Award from the National Press Foundation, the nation's highest honor for a newspaper editor. Moore graduated with honors from the University of Texas at El Paso, earning a BA in political science in 1998. Dr. Villalobos, an associate professor of political science and a UTEP distinguished teaching professor. He currently serves as chair of the Dean's Community Engagement and Leadership, CEL, Task Force and Review Committee, as well as continuing director of Student Enhancement and External Relations for Political Science. His upcoming co-authored manuscript entitled Seeing Us in Them, Social Divisions and the Politics of Group Empathy details a theoretical framework and application of a group empathy index, adopted by both the ANES and VES. Dr. Algara, an assistant professor of political science at the University of Texas at El Paso, joined the department in fall of 2020. Prior to coming to UTEP, Dr. Algara was a 2019-2020 American Political Science Association Congressional Fellow, placed in the U.S. Senate. He received his PhD from the University of California, Davis. His research agenda focuses on the nature of ideological representation in the United States, political parties, electoral accountability, legislative behavior, and what factors inform policy preferences of the mass public. Dominique, a senior political science major and women and gender studies minor. She's involved with Texas Rising, a nonprofit dedicated to civic engagement, URGE, a nonprofit dedicated to gender equity, and she's also vice president of the El Paso Young Democrats. Angelina Martinez, a doctoral candidate in the Borderlands History PhD program at the University of Texas at El Paso. Her research includes public school desegregation along the US-Mexico border and the Mexican-American experience in public education. That said, I want to welcome Dr. Curry.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. There are a lot of you here, and I'm really happy to see that. Felix, if I can ask one favor, Angela Martinez rejoined the chat, and she has a slightly different name. If you could add her to the presenters list, it's just Angela Martinez #2.
Of course, let me go ahead and do that now.
All right,
Angelina, I don't know if you want to just go ahead and try it out.
So I'd like to welcome you all to this virtual Constitution Day. This is a new experience for all of us in this environment. Traditionally, Constitution Day in my years at UTEP has been the Department of Political Science, in conjunction with other institutions on campus, brought in a number of individuals to speak on a variety of topics. And so we're trying our best to sort of mimic that today with a wide range of experts from the borderland region to sort of address questions about the origin of the Constitution and what it means today. And really, I think that's what we're going to focus on in length today, is what the Constitution means for us in our current environment. And so the first question that I have to pose really to all of the panelists, it has to deal with, does the Constitution actually matter? So we live in an era in which civic engagement is generally fairly low, as is some sort of general knowledge of the Constitution. And we watch politicians and scholars debate and fight over what the Constitution says and what it means. We've watched long-held traditions being discarded at a rapid pace, and the messaging of our current presidential election from both parties seems to say that the constitutional democracy that we currently have might collapse if the other side is actually elected. So the question I ask to each of our panelists is, in an environment like this, does our Constitution matter anymore? Anyone feel free to jump in.
I can jump in. Can you hear me? I'm having internet difficulty.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much for that question, Todd. And I think when you pose that question, does it matter? I think there's sort of two dimensions that you can sort of go with that. I think the first is institutional, right? Sort of the rules of the game, how votes get translated into power. And certainly that still matters, right? Constitution's very durable. We have high transaction costs in terms of changing the Constitution. You can't get rid of the United States Senate. One thing to be cognizant of in our discussion today is looking at sort of the distortion of representation in the United States as I sort of see it. We have a presidential election. By any sort of forecasting model, Donald Trump will not win the popular vote. He's got a pretty decent shot of winning the election, depending on the model. That's a problem for democracy in the long term. You're sort of lacking democratic legitimacy. And I think that in our discussion today, one thing that I sort of would like to discuss is what sort of the implications of our constitutional institutions. What are the implications of it in terms as a country not only becomes polarized, but the geographic distribution becomes more pronounced? Bigger states are becoming bigger, smaller states are becoming smaller. And we know that the geographic distribution of people of color, of people that generally vote Democratic, they're being concentrated more in urban areas, and they're being concentrated more in various states. And I think that has profound implications for representation and power. One thing I think is important to sort of consider in the November election is if Donald Trump does get reelected without a plurality, let alone a majority, what does that mean for our Constitution? What does that mean for the health of our institutions? So when you pose that question, my initial reaction is, yeah, of course, institutionally, but also, we're headed in a sort of, some people would say in a constitutional crisis, because the value of a vote is becoming more dependent on where you live increasingly over time.
Yeah, just to bring that forward to sort of give a fine point on it to our students. Think of the United States Senate. Rhode Island, which has a population of about as many people are in this room, has two representatives in the United States Senate. Texas, which has a population that is larger than around 15 other states in the United States combined, also has 2 votes in the United States Senate. So when we talk about vote to representation, that sort of equation, that's a good way to think about it, is Rhode Island, a state that no one has ever been to in their lives, has as much representation as Texas does. So that kind of really gets at that point of what Carlos is talking about. Anyone else want to jump in on this one?
Sure. I will. Todd.
Go ahead, Richard.
I think that the short answer is yes. It matters absolutely, and I think that you're really seeing the rationale for that in the fact that the courts of our major three systems have actually been crucial in the last several months as kind of a bulwark against kind of an imperial presidency or presidency that's moving power in very particular ways. So I think the Constitution lays out the blueprint for that. Here's where I think the challenge is, and I think that the point you and Carlos are making is well taken, which is when we talk about representation issues, there's certainly some minimization of the Constitution, but I think that the bigger issue, or the thing that I think needs to really be at the forefront of the conversation, is really how the Constitution is embodied in different kinds of actions. And I think that that's one thing. And having the students in today's panel discussion is really important, because I think that's it. It's making sure that people remember why the Constitution exists and the context of some of those decisions, and in particular, the context of legal decisions that have been taken in the name of the Constitution or with the Constitution as a guide. Because I think that's one of the big problems. There's this sort of a sense of, these things need to be done, expressed in some of the actions the president has taken. I think the holdback for people in the citizenry that say, no, we shouldn't take those actions or do those things. I think everyone sort of forgets that there's a document that lays out precedent and guidance. And I think that's the real challenge, is getting people to remember why the document exists the way that it does. And I think the other thing, and we're starting to see this, I think, more with people that are doing critical legal studies and folks that are engaged in kind of these deconstructive analyses of like law and systems of institution, is that there is a lot of institutionalized racism that comes both through the execution of some of those constitutional amendments and the way people have dealt with them. But I think part of the problem is we're just sort of forgetting the history and the context of some of those issues. And I think the more that happens, it's a heck of a lot easier for anybody in power to just sort of willy-nilly make these kinds of choices or decisions. So I think that's what you're seeing right now. And I think the more we educate, the more we fulfill that commitment to make sure that our students, among others, know about that, I think the better we are. But yes, I think the Constitution matters.
Bob, you want to pop in and give us your perspective?
Yeah, just a couple of things on why I think the Constitution matters, and also why, if it continues to decline in importance, we're in a lot of trouble. I think in any society, you have to have some shared set of values, and certainly some shared set of facts to move forward. All of that has been breaking down for a number of years. The Constitution, as several people have mentioned now, is essentially the rule book that's supposed to guide us along. And we always have debates about what the Constitution means and what it doesn't. I think increasingly there are people, including those on the right, who used to almost venerate the Constitution, who would say that end results may be more important than the actual Constitution itself right now. And Richard mentioned that the courts have sort of served as a bulwark against some of the executive overreach. I think that was true 2 years ago. I think it's increasingly less true now. And obviously immigration is something that I focused a lot of my coverage on. I think the court system has given the Trump administration carte blanche to do what it wants on using executive authority, often at the expense of Congress. I think the border wall is a perfect example of that. The Congress explicitly limited funding for the border wall at $5 billion, and the Trump administration just evaded that, took money from other purposes, and transferred it. The courts upheld that. The courts have also upheld the migrant protection protocols that have sent thousands of people from who'd come to our area seeking refuge over to Juarez and other Mexican border cities where they're in incredible danger. And I think, especially as Trump has been able to load up on some of the appellate courts, these bulwarks that were once a break on executive overreach have now become, in some ways, complicit with executive overreach.
Thanks. Jose, I think your voice is kind of pertinent to what all of us have been discussing.
Yeah, let me add that. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So I'd say it's as important as ever, maybe more than ever, right now in this time. And I'd like to frame it in terms of the public's role. And just in like in our courses, when we discuss that, as the founders set up this system, the guiding principle of us having our consent to be governed, that we give consent to those that we want to have the privilege to run government and be responsive to us and our rights and our needs and however we want the country to, what direction we want the country to go in. And so it's as important as ever, and requires that people be engaged as much as ever in this coming election, and just in daily politics as much as possible, because people have to pay attention to what's going on to be fully informed. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of things happening, and misinformation or the lack of information are really something that is undermining the process, particularly in such a partisan atmosphere where people are functioning. They're functioning in the manner that their opinions are more based in like a team type mentality of whether their team is ahead or behind, and not enough focus on what's overall best for the country, especially during a pandemic and with all these other things happening. And one other thing I would mention is, at the same token of having people be more and more aware of how big the role is to participate and to push all the process forward, we have to have officials running for office who abide by the public's wishes, and it's very unhealthy to have a situation where a candidate can signal that they may or may not abide by the results of an election, and on top of all the worries we have about making sure that the elections are not being affected negatively by outside forces. So it's a very troubling time, but the best antidote for all of the challenges is people being involved, informed as much as possible, and thinking not just about their personal political preferences or whatever party that they generally support, but also of the overall good of the country and the good of the overall citizenry. And I think if everybody moves in that direction, and such an important thing for this session today, having people here to having this discussion, this is just the kind of thing that is healthy for democracy and good for the constitutional order.
Absolutely. I mean, a lot of us have kind of danced around the idea of hyper-partisanship and how that's playing its way out in terms of representation, in terms of the institutions of government. But all of us have a view, who have spoken so far, have a view as either scholars or those that report on these sort of events. So I'm curious, Dominique, as someone who's involved in activism at a very local level, what's your take on the importance of the Constitution in this environment?
It's definitely important, but I think we see extremism a lot, and that's what makes this Constitution so important. I think, and I'll speak about it a little later, but I feel like we aren't, I don't know, like being an activist, I see that people aren't actively like anti-extremism. So a lot of times it's just, I don't know how to explain it. It's important, but no one's actively trying to stop the one of the other sides to, excuse me, I'm very nervous. I don't know. I don't know. Please forgive me.
No, it's no problem. To give everyone an idea, that the point that Dominique is articulating is that individuals operating within our system and operating for the benefit of our system aren't extremists by definition. They're operating within the institutions and rules of the game and are attempting to maintain them. But extremism, whether left or right, seeks to change the rules of the game or seeks to diminish the rules of the game. And so I think the point that Dominique's trying to make is that it's vitally important for anyone who is an activist, or those who are active at a local level or a national level, is to keep in mind the rules of the game, because that really is what sort of puts us together as a nation. Without something that unites us beyond ideology, we're in a lot more trouble than it would appear to be currently. Angelina, I'm curious if you can provide us a bit of a historical perspective about the Constitution in this time period. So my thought here is that we've clearly, in points in our history, been at constitutional crossroads. Like this isn't the first time. How did we, and how did the Constitution itself survive those periods?
Can you hear me? Am I?
Absolutely, you're there.
Okay. I was having some issues, so I just wanted to make sure you could hear me. Well, I think right now, like, we're seeing a very important historical moment, as far as almost like an allegiance to the Constitution. And I think, like, historically, there have been many moments throughout this country's history where there are communities of people who were marginalized because of the Constitution, or just completely disregarded by many of the important factors of the Constitution. And so there have been historically many contradictions with these promises that the Constitution says it will uphold for all of the United States citizenry, but by and large, many communities have been excluded from that historically. And I'm speaking mostly from the perspective of public education, because that's my niche. But I think that over time, these consistent exclusions have led to temporal lulls in, like, interest in voting for many communities because of their feeling of exclusion. Voting has not been pushed as hard as it is being pushed right now in a very long time. Probably, I would argue, since around the time of the Civil Rights Movement, when a lot of African American communities were emboldened to sort of engage in voting in a very different way than there since then. And so I think that one thing that also kind of cues into me as far as, like, recent historical incidents would probably be the growth of patriotism that came out of the beginning of the turn of the century with what happened with 9/11, and sort of this collective sentiment around patriotism that is tied to a very fundamental perspective of the Constitution as a type of a symbolism, like clinging onto it by U.S. citizens and what it represents. And so it's sort of like been positioned as this return to fundamental and very extreme patriotism that came out of the beginning of the early 2000s. It has since kind of become like its own thing since then.
The weaponization of
Yes.
how to love our country. Yeah, absolutely. So since Angelina is on right now, and you've been talking at least a little bit about your expertise, which is public education policy. And I think it's important because I know people are going to come and go throughout this. I think I want to hear from you first, because I think your expertise means a lot to our students. And so I want to ask you a little bit about desegregation in terms of El Paso. And so you and I have talked about, I think the 14th Amendment of the Constitution is absolutely like the workhorse of the Constitution. It's the most important thing in the Constitution. And for those who are listening, I'm speaking mainly about the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. But in the area of public education, how the 14th Amendment has been used and its power has really evolved over time. And I'm certain that most of the students listening are familiar with Brown v. Board of Education. I know that they know that name. But what might not be clear to a lot of our listeners is that El Paso also has a history of desegregation that has also worked its way through the courts and probably provides a little bit of legacy for many of our students who came up in terms of public education in the city. So I was curious if you could talk about how the 14th Amendment has sort of changed and transformed the environment that all of us live in.
I think that, okay, so the 14th Amendment, as far as it applies to public education, wasn't really introduced into the battles for desegregation of public schools until like until 1946. Whenever I talk to students in El Paso about public education, I feel like this always resonates with them, that initially the desegregation cases in California were centered around Spanish-speaking Mexican students and the exclusion of them from public schools because of the language barriers. So I feel like that always resonates with them, that it wasn't necessarily a Black and white student issue all the time, especially in areas of the Southwest. So we started to see the 14th Amendment get used in the courts with the Equal Protection Clause in 1946 in Orange County, and that court case is called the Mendez versus Westminster court case, was what ultimately desegregated the state of California, which was the first state to impose statewide desegregation of their public schools. And so that immediately informed the Brown decision, because Thurgood Marshall was also involved in the counsel of that court case. And it wasn't until much later, though, so this is happening right after all that happens, all across the Southwest. Numerous court cases start popping up through Southwest states having to do with the segregation of Mexican American students, not necessarily just Black and white students like we were seeing in a lot of other areas of the country. And so in El Paso, since it's the founding of its public education system in the late 19th century, it was set up intending to keep areas of the city segregated. We saw that. We can still see it today in El Paso.
Sounds like Angelina's having, a little bit of difficulty. One of the fun parts about doing remote sessions during this time is that, hey, you're back.
I'm here. Can you hear me? So
yes,
sorry.
We can.
So I was saying we can still see it in areas of El Paso, especially South El Paso, with schools such as Bell, Alta Vista, Bowie High School, Douglas, all of those schools, Aoy, they were all intended to intentionally. Sorry, can you hear me? And moreover, of West El Paso. So in the 1970s, there was a court case that was initiated in the early 1970s, and it was the lead counsel on it was Albert Armendariz, who was a very renowned judge in the El Paso area later in his life, and who had formerly been the president of LULAC, which was the League of United Latin American Citizens, a Mexican American civil rights group that was very active in the middle of the 20th century. And by the end of the decade, in 1978, EPISD was found that it was found that they were unconstitutionally segregating Spanish-speaking Mexican students in the El Paso area schools, especially those in the South Side areas. And when, I guess, to familiarize some of the students with specifically the schools, where Coronado High School was one of the high schools that they had found out were intentionally busing Mexican students to the Mexican schools rather than like allowing for them to attend the white high school.
Perfect.
So that's sort of brief.
Very brief. And if you're interested in more, it turns out you can take courses with Angelina at UTEP, and there's definitely more to learn. I talk about desegregation on the border a little bit in my con law classes too, though not with a degree of expertise anywhere approaching Angelina's. And so for those of you who are logging in or have logged in the recent few minutes, we're going to begin taking questions around 3:50, so in around 20 minutes, we're going to be taking questions. So I'm going to ask for you all to hold off until that point, and we're just going to go through with our panelists and sort of talk about the Constitution and where it is. So up next, I think I want to talk to Dr. Pineda. If in part because Dr. Pineda is very much a product of those public schools here in El Paso as well. But I think Dr. Pineda and I share an interest in the First Amendment pretty significantly. And so to sort of explain to our students where I'm going with this, we know that the First Amendment protects political speech, but it does so in a very narrow environment usually. And that very narrow environment is what are known as traditional public forums. These are sidewalks, college campuses, city hall, those sorts of areas. But there's been an argument proliferating recently that these traditional public forums are really outdated as means of political communication, that these tools, these areas really aren't nearly as used as they used to be. And forums like social media, namely Facebook and Twitter, seem to be new political forums, and that's where individuals communicate politics. So there's been a discussion that the First Amendment, at least in part, the protections that we have historically found in traditional public forums should apply to these new forums, should apply to social media. And as a scholar of communication, I'm curious, what's your take on this discussion?
Yeah, that's a great question, Todd. There's a couple of different things that are important to remember at this point in history. Social media is intriguing because it's not a social good, right? It's not a social space in the way that the framers I think conceived of having exchanges of ideas, and you can see this. I mean, I kind of chuckle every time I see somebody repost the message on Facebook, right? I hereby deny Facebook the ability to use any of my pictures, right? On. And people forget that it's a private business that you've actually entered into on your own accord, and because people don't read the terms of service, or maybe they just don't get it, they sort of have this emphatic like Facebook cannot do this, right? My favorite now is people complaining about social media on social media, right? People that take to Facebook and have these kind of screeds about how things don't work, and I'm like, you're not really helping. Here's the challenge, and I think this is one of the big issues that really concerns me about this next election, which is that data and digital presence is being weaponized. And I mean, I think that's the thing, right? Anytime we talk about the social contract that's associated with the Constitution, I mean, and I take Bob's point from earlier spot on. I mean, I think he's right. I mean, I'm thinking of the courts as this kind of backstop, but clearly there's problems with that. But ideally, this is all about a social contract, right? We have a document. The document should guide us. We agree in principle to the document, and if somehow we violate it, then we kick in a series of mechanisms to evaluate it, right? But absent that, it's a document that we sort of hold as kind of a general direction. I think the challenge with social media, especially right now, is is that if we assumed that this was actually a fair process, in other words, person X says, here's my opinion, and person Y says, well, that's a great point, but let me debate you because I disagree. That would be one thing. But the problem is, especially with these, and this assumes, by the way, an active offensive weaponized system where somebody is sitting in a room in another country or even in the United States and says, I'm going to poke and I'm going to aggravate and I'm going to lie and I'm going to do that. And so, we have the Constitution and there should be these principles that protect a certain level of speech. But I think that really this is one of those questions of where like the change in technology was not assumed, and we're really slow. I mean, in terms of the way that we litigate and in the terms of the ways we legislate to adjust to those kinds of challenges, and that's a real problem. And I think it's especially a problem because we still can't even understand. I mean, I think social media companies probably do, but we the consumers can't understand what is real, right? And I think this is one of the big challenges is the more that we're susceptible to listening to news. I mean, this is one of the things I always tell my students in my large intro class. All you need to do, even if you don't want to get into the politics of Facebook, is track how many times a user posts an obituary for somebody famous that has been dead for more than 2 or 3 years, right? That to me is the red flag. As soon as you see that, it means that somebody is not being a critical consumer of information. So we could say, listen, there is a law or a rule that says that you need to be cautious or you need to be more astute about the information you share. But this is what I tell students: as long as somebody posts, I mean, and then you can also see it grow exponentially in a short period of time. So about 2 weeks ago, it was Gene Wilder, right? And somebody posts, oh my goodness, Gene Wilder died. And then within a day, right, you see this. And that ebb and flow is so easy to predict in some ways and so sort of hard to guesstimate. But I think this is the heart of it, right? So our conversations about the First Amendment, I think, are crucial. You need it because, the New York Times needs that protection in the way that Bob's publication needs that protection. But what is going to undermine that is the fact that you've got bots or that you have third-party external agents that are using our sense of protection as part of their offensive capability, and it's a weird needle to thread. And so if you ask me, look, would you give up First Amendment protection to stop those kinds of attacks? I would say no. I would say we still need to enshrine those protections, but boy, does that get harder and harder, especially in the way that we see these creeping kind of tentacles. And so yeah, I think we need to be super cautious, especially right now as we get into this election cycle, because it's going to be, I mean, I think it's going to be weaponized in a way that we probably haven't even quite dreamed or had nightmares about. And so I think it's going to get worse the next couple of months.
It seems kind of funny that we're saying this next election cycle is so that's something that, is a ways off, when in reality we're going to blink and we are in the next election cycle, and these tools are being absolutely and currently used right now. Which is why I think we should probably talk to Bob Moore for a second, because we know that democracy at its core to work requires informed voters. Like that's a prerequisite of democracy. And in the past, publishing outlets were among the easiest ways to inform voters. But social media, as we just discussed, largely distorts that historical relationship. And so I'm curious, what is it that newspaper, magazine, TV, actual news reporters offer that is better than the direct information that we can receive currently directly from elected officials and directly from policymakers? What is it that news media offers us that this sort of direct connection that we have doesn't?
I'm a little choked up because I just heard that Gene Wilder died. So forgive me as I adjust to this news. I'll start with sort of the romantic notion, and then maybe add a little reality check. I mean, the thing that news media traditionally have done in this country is sort of serve as a vetter of information. And so an elected official says something, the reporter checks it. If it's correct, passes it along. If not, maybe corrects it or whatever. That's the way it's supposed to work. I'm not so sure it always really did work that way. And I think the other thing to remember is that the modern news media as we know it, with this sort of this middle of the road objective approach to news is a fairly recent development in our society. We used to have a very, very partisan news media, but over the last century or so, this false notion of objectivity sort of took hold, and you wind up with both sidesism kind of taking over, and journalists really becoming stenographers, and just it's like, well, this person said this and this person said that, and you still unfortunately see a lot of that, particularly in local media environments that have really been ravaged by financial pressures. But I still think even in that weakened state, good journalism has a lot of value, because getting information directly from political figures is an okay thing to do. I actually encourage people to do that. But obviously people are always going to serve their own best interests. And so we need some institutions in this country that can sort of serve as brakes on misinformation. I think fact checking has gotten to be in vogue over the last decade. But there's a lot of really good research out there that suggests that aggressive fact checking actually just hardens the beliefs of people. So I think journalism is still trying to figure out where it fits in the current environment, especially in the fire hose of social media. One of the other things that I think is really important to point out, the difference between a traditional newspaper or television station and something like Facebook or Twitter. Under the law, as a publisher, I am liable for anything that I present on El Paso Matters. So, if I defame Richard Pineda with something that's untrue and grossly damaging to his character, he could sue me and use that as a means to punish me, hold me accountable, or put me out of business. Congress has written protections in to communication law over the last couple of decades that basically say that these giant tech companies are not publishers, and so they're not responsible for even the worst of the offensive stuff that goes up on their website. And I think we need to figure out how to address that in a way that's consistent with First Amendment values. It's obviously you go down a very dangerous tightrope when you start talking about trying to regulate even false speech, because who's to determine that it's false? We've had the same discussion over hate speech for years and years, and it basically used that discussion as a reason not to address hate speech. So there are all of these. The First Amendment was obviously written in the late 18th century to serve the world of the time. I don't know that it works particularly well, 230 some years later.
Yeah.
And if I could just add, Todd, real quick, I think this is, like the thing that, people have started the last couple of days getting ready to gear up for this, to drop off of Facebook and all the social media for a day or for 2 days to protest social injustice and the use of hate speech. But of course, the irony is that they're using the same social media platforms. And so in a nutshell, that's the challenge, right? So we can have these tools which are amazing in terms of connecting people, but they're still transitory and they still come with all these problems. So in the same way I'm going to take a stand against Facebook, I got to put it on Facebook so that you know that you're going to take a stand against Facebook, right? Like that, there's an irony there that is really hard to disentangle from what we're trying to grapple with, I think.
Yeah, I think I often tell medias exactly what, or tell my students exactly what Bob said, is that this nonpartisan, unbiased media is such a modern notion. That even the founders wouldn't recognize nonpartisan media. Like, they were in an environment that the media was 100% partisan. And so this idea that the media are fact checkers and exist to provide some sort of oversight over our elected leaders in an unbiased fashion is really new. And that's at least part and parcel why Congress as an institution was given oversight as part of its role, as it had an oversight role over the other institutions of government. And so, Carlos, or Dr. Algara, I want to talk to you a little bit about sort of this congressional oversight role. So if we know that to some extent, it's not that the media really isn't actively playing an oversight role that we envision they should, how is Congress doing in its oversight role? As we know, Congress has this oversight power. How is it doing in engaging in oversight? And is that oversight anyway modified in this time we're living in of extreme political and ideological division?
I think that's a great question. And one thing that it's a great question, especially in the context of the bombshell that, was dropped on El Paso within the last 48 hours. Just blatant disregard for human rights, forced sterilization, something that should not be happening in a democracy. And Congress has a direct role to play here, right? Its prerogative is oversight. And to answer, the short answer to your question is no, Congress is not providing oversight because they have a political incentive not to. And that's one thing I sort of want to talk about here just briefly. It's the system, the constitutional governance in America is broken. The system is supposed to work where the president is elected by one set of constituency, individual members of Congress are elected by another, and senators are elected by another, right? They're all different constituencies, which is the key to dispersing power. What you're seeing right now is this sort of timidness Congress collectively vis-a-vis the president. Even when the House is controlled by Democrats, you don't see Nancy Pelosi using subpoena powers, right, to subpoena members of the administration over the course of these atrocities here in El Paso. And I will be very surprised if the House actually does something to hold the administration accountable over what's going on the ground here in El Paso. So that's not working according to the institutional setup within the Constitution. Another thing that's actually more troubling is that these members of Congress over the course since Vietnam has delegated to the president and conceded a lot more power. So, we have this administration, and I don't want to pick on the Republicans at large, but, signing these ridiculous executive orders about payroll tax cuts. The president does not have the authority to do that. President Obama didn't have the authority to extend, for example, right? Even though that happens to be a decision that I happen to agree with. That it's the prerogative of the Congress to legislate. And Congress is not, quite frankly, legislating. And that just emboldens the president. So that's not working. And I think there's a little bit of an asymmetry here between the Democrats and the Republicans. And the asymmetry is this. Generally, we're supposed to have shared democratic norms, right? Now we're entering this weird dynamic where the Republicans really don't care about the electoral integrity of the country, where we have this distortion at the state level of disenfranchising people. And, you just have to look here in Texas where, it's very hard to, register to vote. As somebody not from Texas, it blew my mind that I can't get an absentee ballot. To me, as a political scientist that says Texas wants to make wants to increase the cost to exercise my constitutional right relative to California. That's a problem. That's a partisan decision. That's an institutional decision. And there's no oversight with respect to making sure that everybody has access, equal access under the law.
I'm actually going to use that time to remind our students, since it's brought up voting in the state of Texas, the best and safest way for everyone on this call to vote is to vote early. in this city. And so I would call on all of you. I don't care who you vote for as long as you exercise your franchise, but the safest and best way to do it for individuals our age is to make sure you're voting early. And if you have the ability to be a poll worker and are interested in that, there is a desperate need in El Paso for poll workers, and the city pays well. So if that's something you're interested in, I would urge all of those who are listening in to actually do that. I'm going to go ahead and move to Dr. Villalobos, because we heard from Dr. Algara that Congress is sort of failing in its oversight role. And I was reminded of what happens when Congress even tries to exercise that oversight role. And today they called on Chad Wolf to show up and testify before Congress. And Chad Wolf went, "Nah, I'm not going to do that. There's no need for me to show up for that subpoena." And he just completely ignored it. And so the question I'm posing to Dr. Villalobos is about what this means for presidential power. Because our founders had one vision when it came to presidential power under the Constitution. How has that changed over time, and how can we sort of justify the behavior of what we're seeing today with the understanding of what the founders wanted with regard to the balance of power between the presidency and Congress?
Sure. So definitely the founders, as Dr. Algara said so eloquently, that the key was basically different constituencies setting up across time those checks and balances across the different branches, and that they could hold each other accountable and could mediate the public's best interests and not have everything going through like some kind of a vacuum of power. However, I should say at the very start, back in the 1787, there was such an emphasis while the country was beginning and setting up a more stronger central government with a clear executive branch, with the president at the top of that branch. There was the anti-federalists, and even among the federalists, there was a lot of consideration given to make sure that whoever was in that position would not abuse that power as time went on. And everything from what we've seen happen constitutionally in terms of the time of term, 4-year terms, and then having a 2-term limit, and even the process of impeachment and removal were all put into place for good reason. And that also extends to others. We talk about impeachment; it applies to judges and to members of Congress and other officials as well. And so from then until the modern time, until now, going to 2020. So we've seen this exponential growth of presidential power that's happened over time. And as Dr. Algara mentioned, there's a lot of what's happened is that presidents across time have been able to take advantage of their position to test the other branches in how far they can go in using their powers. And there's some great research done by people like a scholar named Lou Fisher, who talks about the abdication of power, that precedents have been set over time where Congress has not adequately pushed back against the presidency, where the judicial branch has not adequately pushed back against the executive. And in terms of things like war powers, this has been so, and there's a lot of reasons, but I know we also want to get to student questions, so I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible. But we've seen this overall growth. More recently, we've started, there's a lot of talk in the past about the foreign powers and things like that. Domestically, there's a lot going on too, and our panelists have talked about the border wall, immigration more generally, our civil rights protests and the right for people to assemble peacefully. And then you even talk about the checks and balances between national level and state local level in determining to what extent people can have their voices heard and issues can be addressed. At the same time, while we're talking about all this growth, it is important to note that those tools that were, or those functions that were put into place by the founders are still functioning. We have had 2 modern presidents impeached, not removed, but both Clinton and now Trump have been impeached, and we have the situation of an incumbent running, though impeached, running for re-election, and the removal process did not occur, and then even a bit earlier in our modern history, Richard Nixon resigned before something like that was expected to have happened. So there is a pushback that can occur in extreme cases. There is a sense of accountability, but there's a lot that gets lost in between the extremes. There's a lot to do also with the president's staffing, the size of the executive branch that has grown tremendously over time, and the people surrounding a president. There are people who are staffed, who are put into their positions with the advice and consent of Congress, and there are others who are not, that just serve at the pleasure of the president. And when you have people who are not with the consent of Congress in government, and they may be doing things that are beyond their legal role when they are instigating policies on behalf of a president, or regardless, kind of on their own, all those things can become troublesome if there isn't a proper oversight. And so I hope that kind of answers the question. So I'd say probably the thing that most stands out is just the overall exponential growth of the branch, and how how much relative power the presidency has gained compared to the other 2 branches. And I think there's an under reporting, or under a need for more focus on the president's broader staff and the roles that they play, and the interconnections between the president and staff, which sometimes are at odds with each other, even within an institution. So, and that's a whole other can of worms. I have like 40 other things I want to say, but I'll leave it there and for the Q&A.
Yeah, I listened to that, and I'm reminded yesterday of the head of the CDC testifying before Congress, saying one thing, and literally 2 hours later, the president saying something entirely different. And so that just gives you the idea of how disconnected these systems can actually be. So we now have a number of questions from our students, and I think that's absolutely fantastic. So I'm going to be going through them, and I'm going to try to direct them at people in particular, and especially so that we can sort of get the spread around to all of us. So I'm going to open this question up to all of us generally, because I think all of us probably have sort of our own take on this. But Will writes he would like to know the panel's thought on what ought to be done to curb governmental overreach by the executive and judicial branches, at the same time that we have a Congress that is so polarized that our country often faces governmental shutdowns. So if I think the core of this question is, what can be done by citizenry when the 3 branches of government absolutely don't work together to make policy, or even to check each when policy goes awry? There are a few political scientists on the call, and I know exactly what our answers are going to be for the most part. So I'm curious from people like Rich and Bob, and especially Dominique, who's sat through my classes, and I'm certain sat through some of Dr. Villalobos' classes as well. I'm curious, Dominique, what's your perspective on how do we hold these institutions accountable when they appear absolutely not to be in most circumstances?
I feel like regarding like the political environment, it isn't exclusive to government intervention. As we've been seeing these past few months with the Black Lives Matter movement, people will take matters into their own hands. We're seeing the removal of racist historical figures from their places of revered power, and making them and this country's history acknowledge its racist past and history. But as an activist, I feel like we're holding these people accountable to, again, acknowledge this history without glorifying it. So I feel like at the end of the day, while certain political figures can back up a movement like this, I believe the last word will always belong to the people. No pun intended, but First Amendment. But yeah, I just feel like we're sort of losing faith in our government a little bit because of everything that's been going on. And I did see a question kind of like that. But I think at least Generation Z, right? We're coming to the realization that the power has more, I mean, the people have more power than we thought we did. So that's my perspective. I think at the end of the day, if we have to tear down these racist statues, then we're going to do it. I think a lot of it has to do with like losing faith in these government like entities, really.
Yeah, I look at the system, and I have some ideas as a political scientist about what we could do to make them more responsive. But I'm going to actually tie this into a question that Alpha said. And Alpha's asked kind of two questions. She says that the Constitution says we the people, but over the past 4 years doesn't feel like we have any power over our elected officials. We're told to vote, but when we have it, but we have a system where the winner of elections is not the person the majority voted for. And so she ties that in with, would the electoral system work differently if we had more voter turnout? And how would the popular vote affect this country? Well, absolutely, the system would be different if popular vote was binding as opposed to the Electoral College, but that's not the system we have. The system we have where the Electoral College is given primacy is the Constitution, and the U.S. Constitution is abysmal and very resistant to change. Changing the U.S. Constitution is highly problematic. So I'm curious, the panel has any perspective. Would voter turnout, increased voter turnout, solve sort of the problems we're seeing? Or are there other places really that we should hang our hat?
If I could provide a couple of ideas here. Yeah, voter turnout for sure. And I'm one of the professors on campus who works a lot with the students. We're trying to get everybody registered to vote as much as possible. The more people participate, the better. Again, regardless of the choices, it's a matter of increasing participation, increasing more healthy debate, and politicians take note if the public is more engaged. And I think it's also very important not to simply think about at the very top the presidential ticket, but down through congressional elections, down to the state level, to the local elections too. There's a saying of all politics being local, and some of the times that we have some of the worst turnout in elections is in local politics, where very, very small percentages take part. And there is no electoral college to worry about for some of these other races. You do get a majority vote. It's just that you have nowhere near a majority of citizens participating. And so if politicians take heed that very few people are engaged, they're going to take advantage of keeping track of who is engaged and serve that small number of people who they consider their constituency. The more that people come out to get involved, get informed, the more they're going to feel that they are going to be held accountable, even just getting their foot in the door to serving in a position. And they're going to feel much more threatened to be kicked out of office if people are paying attention and participating and having healthy discussion. And as we, I think, have observed throughout this pandemic, there's all kinds of things happening at the national level and a lot of debates about the way things are being handled nationally. But a lot of it has been left to the state and local level. And there's a very big difference in how Americans have been experiencing this pandemic, depending on where they live and who their local politicians are, what kind of guidance and rules they're pertaining to, and whether or not this virus is posing a more deadly threat or is being more so contained, depending on how local politics is working in certain parts of the country. And I think, we love to have this conversation in class about how, I mean, just the 50 states are like 50 different ongoing experiments. And then you can take it down to the city level, right? Even to the neighborhood level. And so we are in a system where we can observe a lot of different experiments happening across communities. And if we are involved, we can direct which way we want to go and how we can really solve some of these most critical issues, I think. So that I hope that provides some more food for thought.
Yeah, I'm going to keep this conversation going on elections, because I was joking with Dr. Pineda before this whole thing got started, as Bob Moore, Dr. Pineda, and I are regularly among the folks who commentate on local elections and elections here more generally. I'm curious what their perspective is, because I know that oftentimes when I go on TV to talk about these elections, what I'm not saying is what I know as a political scientist. I don't say how we could solve a lot of these problems because I feel a little bit restricted in doing so. But I know Bob absolutely does not feel restricted in what he says on TV. So I'm curious what Bob actually has to say in this regard.
So to answer the original question, which is a very good question, of whether increasing turnout would make a difference, my answer would be just look at all of the efforts that are underway to suppress turnout, and there's your answer. Of course it makes a difference, and that's why there's so much effort. And I'm glad you mentioned the local elections, because we tend to focus on Trump and the presidential election, and that's really important. But we're also going to elect a mayor and 4 members of city council here. There's a contested state senate race, contested at least on paper. So there are things for voters here to decide that are incredibly important to the rest of their lives. We just had a runoff election for district attorney that's going to have a large say in how our criminal justice system proceeds for the next 4 years, and very, very few people voted. And so this is the perspective I'd like to leave with everybody. The median age of El Pasoans is somewhere around 34 years old. In any given election, the median age of voters is like 56 to 57 years old. There's a huge disconnect there. And we like to say that elections are about the future. But if elections really are about the future, why do more voters look like me than look like your students? And so I think it's really important to get engaged. And I think the biggest reason people don't participate in the political process is because they're not asked. I think the political parties are making a huge mistake right now in not aggressively courting the Latino vote, including in states like Texas, where you may not think things are going to be competitive. We need especially young Latinos to turn out in places like El Paso, because this community is very reflective of what the future of this nation looks like. And we can really have a large say in that if we can get folks to turn out to vote. But we know that the political parties aren't going to do it. Political candidates aren't going to do it because they're just going to focus on the people who regularly vote. So it's really up to us. I was really thrilled to hear one of the students being part of several nonprofit efforts to drive voter engagement. I think that's really important. So I think that's really the path. Absolutely, turnout matters because if it didn't, people wouldn't be expending tremendous amounts of energy to keep people who look an awful lot like the folks on this call from voting.
And I would jump in. Oh, so go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess from an organizer perspective, like I work in a nonprofit that dedicates a lot of time for voter outreach and just civic engagement in general. I think a lot of times we're just missing like the motivation. Not only do just voters look like Robert Moore, right? Like the people we're electing also look like Robert Moore. And I think it was exciting when El Paso voted for Bernie Sanders, right? I think that's what the future wants. But I think my generation, at least, is coming to terms with the fact that voting isn't liberation, voting isn't the end all be all. And so I think that's where the disconnect is. In my opinion, at the end of the day, no matter who wins in November, the community is always going to have the community's back. And again, maybe that just is just me having like a lack of faith in our government. But at the end of the day, I'm the one donating money to GoFundMe's. I'm the one like there for my community. So like politicians just simply aren't. So I don't think we're excited to be voting really. So yeah, that's just my take as a student.
Yeah, and I just will point out, if any one of the possible Democratic candidates did look like Bob Moore, it would actually probably be Bernie Sanders, who looks a lot like Bob Moore. And so Dr. Pineda, what would you like to add to this?
Yeah, well, so look, I mean, I think that Dominique's point's well taken, but I think that there's also, I mean, this is sort of the challenge, and I'll describe, I mean, I teach one of the large intro classes at the university, so, you know, about 200 students. In the last presidential election, when Sanders didn't make the cut for the nomination, about half of the students that were very engaged and very vocal sort of rolled up into a ball and said, I don't want to play anymore because my person didn't get through. And when Clinton lost, the remaining half rolled into another ball and said, I don't want to play because the system is fixed. And the best advice I have, you know, being engaged in politics, being engaged in the process, is you have to operate on the assumption you are going to lose. And I think the second that you do that, then the perspective changes on what to do to win. And that's fundamentally the problem. And I think that there is this is not a short game, right? This is not just one city election for mayor. This is not just a presidential election. This is a long-term investment that is about civic responsibility as much as it is understanding what these premises are at the table. And I think that's one of the things that's challenging. I mean, I am, you know, when we talk about political campaigns in particular, when we talk about what kind of symbols are used and how people engage in certain kinds of language choices, I mean, I think we are accepting the premise that it should be easier for people to understand what the political process is. And I think that the second that we do that, the more likely we are to have fewer and fewer people voting. And I do think that it matters because it's not only about representative government at these lower levels, about making sure that the city council, that the mayor's position, that the district attorney's office, that those cases in those spaces are full, but it's also that you are creating a collective effort to try to push candidates forward. And that's something that we have not done in a long time. I mean, Bill Bradley was probably the last person that established a national system in which they were training activists and building activists up to start running for office that then would start be looking to higher levels of office. Bill Bradley, so 96, Bob, I mean, I can't remember when the last time that Bradley was in the saddle for this, but I mean, that's it, right? So if you don't set up these kinds of systems that are collective and they're engaged across a spectrum, what's going to end up happening is you're going to have spikes on certain kinds of levels, and that's not going to engage in the process. But I think, you know, I say this all the time, like, you've got to be prepared to lose, and you've got to know what the reaction to that loss is, because I think it's easy to say that the systemic racism prevents engagement. I think it's easy to say that participation doesn't model what communities look like, but the challenge fundamentally becomes, if you can't wedge into some of those conversations, then that system is only going to get worse, right? It's going to be a lot harder to deconstruct any of this, and I think that's the real challenge. I think that it's possible. But I think it's about the long game, right? You've got to sit people down and say, this is we're looking at 5 to 10 years to try to make this kind of change. And I think that immediately becomes, I mean, that's a heavy weight, right? It's a tremendously heavy weight to think about this. But I think that's part of our inability, regardless of your political belief, to set up a system that's there. It just so happens that at the national level, one political system is a little bit better about inculcating their cluster of people, but I think that's one of the challenges. So I think it's not just turnout. It's about voter education. And I say this all the time because you get a lot of people that are registering folks to vote, but they're not actually talking to people about what that voting looks like, what the races are, what they should be looking for as characteristics. Again, to Bob's point, like vote for whoever you want for district attorney, but understand what that job means and understand what that implication is for things like enforcing marijuana laws or things like enforcing the civil and criminal penalties on certain kinds of issues. Because if you know that, then maybe you think, well, I should vote in this race. This is a really big deal. But I think a lot of people, and we're going to see this a little bit in November. I bet you we see big turnout locally for the presidential race. I bet you we see big undervotes in the city council and mayor's race because people are like, well, I don't really know who these people are, or I don't like them, or whatever. But I think you'll see a lot of people look for the presidential race.
Yeah. So, all right, go ahead.
Hey, I was going to add real quick to what Richard said. That I know that for some of the projects that I'm involved with in the past, to frame them as voter registration drives, and I think voter awareness and registration is much more useful and important to emphasize the aspect of just first raising awareness about who's running, what the issues are, and just basic information about things, and then as a second step, the registration process. I think that's very useful, and I'm glad that he mentioned that.
If I could just add one point, and I think we're sort of making an assumption here that I think should be challenged. And the challenge is this: do voters get it right? Do voters make good decisions with respect to accentuating their preferences? We have one political candidate that is running a campaign that's not about differences in policy. That's not about differences in the government's role in the economy, or tax cuts, or healthcare. He's running a demagoguery campaign. And I think it's a fair question. I think that we should be asking, what is the health of democratic dialogue in America? And why do so many young people feel like their votes are not being, translated into actual power? I think it's, I think voter turnout is great. I think we should try to maximize that. But institutions place limits on how votes are translated into seats, right? And if, of course, the literature says, I don't want to get too academic, but it's easier to, get organized interests to do something at the expense of latent interests. In the United States Senate, if you want to stop something from passing, you need 41 senators. Climate change has a broad consensus to do something. Nothing's getting done. Why? You need 41 senators. Gun control to address, the barbaric acts here in El Paso. Why does that nothing happen? Well, Mitch McConnell has centralized power, and gun control legislation that has broad public support doesn't make it onto the floor of the Senate. I think that we should really start critically assessing whether or not citizens are actually well equipped to make, to hold politicians accountable, for not passing policies that they agree with. Because right now, at least empirically, it seems to me that, politicians, the electoral connection is broken, that there really is no electoral penalty for not being responsive to public opinion. Yet incumbents are being reelected at a higher rate. It's a little bit less at the local level, but, we have this sort of paradox where politicians are not being responsive to public opinion. By the same token, sending the same people to Austin, to City Hall, and to Washington, D.C. So at least for me, it's not entirely clear how we get responsiveness. And I think it's well warranted some people's skepticism in terms of actually understanding whether or not their voice has a say, especially when you look at national politics.
Yeah, so I'm gonna segue that because someone else asked a question. I lost who it was because my browser locked up. That says, I wonder if the panel thinks about the growing lack of faith in the national electoral politics and its effects with the institution propped up by the Constitution. I think that provides a perfect segue to that question. And my response is, I'm almost certain Dominique has heard this response. I'm pretty sure she's heard it in class. But there is a lot of effort by a lot of activists under the age of 35 that are very interested in getting progressive and alternative candidates elected to office. At the national level, at the presidential level, also in Congress, and My response to that has always been, yeah, that's good. That's a promising effort. But on the national level, you're almost always going to lose. And the reason for that is because the institutions of elections are designed to make those candidates lose. So all of this effort and all of this activism that I see young people go through, I'm absolutely impressed by it. I'm in awe of it, and I could not think it's more misguided. If you want to change who is getting elected to office, you need to focus on the rules that get votes onto who gets in office. If you want to have a third-party system or a four-party system, you absolutely have to change the rules by which we count votes. And all of the activists that I see working to get good, interesting, well-meaning candidates into office are fighting against institutional mechanisms that are in large part preventing them from actually doing so. So I think get out the vote campaigns are great for what they are. I think civic engagement is great. I think the growth of youth activism is something that brightens my heart to see. But if I could provide the youth with one sort of guiding mechanism is make sure the work you're doing actually has the possibility to accomplish your goals. And in the arena of electoral politics, sometimes it doesn't. And I would rather see the youth put forth all of this amazing effort in a fashion that can possibly pay off. Anyone else think about the disconnect between electoral politics?
I think that's spot on locally, and I mean Bob can probably talk to this as well. But I mean, if people understood how the city charter worked and understood how they could change the city charter, I think you would have a revolution in terms of what local politics would look like. And I think, this is one of the fights right now. People complain about the city manager form of government that we have, but that was taken to the voters. It was put into the city charter, and it literally is the way that the law that governs the municipal entity operates. But I mean, this is I think that point is super, super well taken. This idea that you could, if you understand rules, really shift the way that the process works. And that's, I mean, you're seeing that at the upper level. And I think Carlos was talking about that with Mitch McConnell. Like, the reason the Republicans are so good at this particular moment is because they understand all of these legislative processes, right? And it's horrible because some of these things are antiquated and there's this sort of sense of that's unfair, that doesn't work. But literally, if you know the rule book and you spend time with the rule book, and here's the kicker, studying the rule book and knowing the rule book is not exciting. It is not interesting. There's nothing, engaging about that process. That's it. Once you have that tool set, it's the ultimate Audre Lorde, right? I mean, it's using the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, and that's it. I mean, that's the path. And I think you're spot on with that.
All right. I think we're going to take one more question. We're about ready to run out of time. But before we take that last question, I want to thank all the students who logged in. I want to thank our presenters who were with us for this call, and thanks for the engagement that we've all sort of experienced. I'm very happy to see it. The session has obviously been recorded and will be available on YouTube and also on SELC's website. So we're going to take one last question that I have sort of down here and give it to everyone and let them sort of peruse over it. So I think this is a really interesting question, and I think everyone will have an interesting perspective on it. And it's something that obviously we don't talk a lot about locally. And that's the lack of power of Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has, in terms of voting power, none. They get to vote for the president. They have very, very little influence. What would D.C. statehood, or even taken farther, Puerto Rican statehood, what would statehood for these entities mean with regard to representation in the United States and electoral outcomes just by changing 50 to 51 or 50 to 52? How would that change our environment?
I think that's a great question. And as somebody who actually was living in DC without Senate representation, and I actually happen to be born in Puerto Rico, it's something that, is pretty near and dear to my heart. I think the discussion here, and I'll make this brief, is troubling, and it's troubling for the following reason. People deserve representation independent of partisan outcomes. I don't think there's anybody that subscribes to democratic theory that suggests DC should not get a representation because their 2 Democratic senators are going to be Democrats, or their representative is going to be a Democrat. That's, if you look at Mitch McConnell, and he said this 2 days ago, why he doesn't want to entertain DC or Puerto Rican statehood, it's because they would more likely than not elect Democratic senators. That is troubling, sort of as a small d Democrat, that we're framing the discussion in those terms. In terms of substantive representation, you look no further than the Hurricane Maria that just completely destroyed Puerto Rico. It would have been a lot different if you had 2 Democratic senators from Puerto Rico in the United States Senate, or 2 Republican senators pounding their fists on the desk, holding up legislation, using every single procedural tool at their disposal to suggest that Puerto Rico will get the funding. In Hurricane Sandy that knocked over New Jersey, that's exactly what you saw. You saw Frank Lautenberg and Bob Mendez use every single procedural trick at their disposal to hold the hostage until New Jersey got their appropriations. There's nothing more troubling, I think, in America, that we sort of normalized the discussion that somehow you deserve representation if you're going to hold competitive elections between the 2 parties. I think that's the starting point, and I think it's a great question, and I think it's a stain, quite frankly, on our democracy that we're even debating whether or not American citizens in Puerto Rico or DC deserve congressional representation.
Angelina, can you give us a little bit of a historical perspective on this question? I mean, why does DC and Puerto Rico, why don't they have representation? If you know, as honestly, this is something I'm naive about too. So I'm asking exactly like the students are. What is the context here? And she might not be here right now. Oh, there she is.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
DC, I'm not certain. I'm not 100% on, but Puerto Rico, I think, is simply because of the fact that it's a territory, that it's not considered an actual state. It was never annexed. Am I using the right word? Annexed into the country as a state. It never acquired statehood. Has not yet.
Yeah, it would it have been easier when it was first annexed as a territory, or easier now? I mean, that seems to be a truism, but what do you think would the effect on our country have been to add a 51st state?
I'm not 100%. And I think that's a really good question. I know that for some of the southern states, when they were annexed in as states rather than territories, and I'm speaking specifically about New Mexico and Arizona, that it was very contentious because of its large population of Mexican Americans. So I would assume that perhaps that same sentiment was around Puerto Rico, which kind of led many individuals to not want to have that voting block of a minority.
Yeah, so it seems that this would absolutely have to be something we consider going forward. Bob, did you want to give something before we sign off?
Yeah, just one point. We're talking here in some ways about addressing a lack of representation and a lack of adherence to democratic principles by adding 2 Senate seats to one population center, Washington, D.C., that has fewer people than El Paso, and a second population center in Puerto Rico that has fewer people than live on the counties in the Texas-Mexico border. It just points back to the inherent anti-democratic nature of the Senate. And so, you know, and regardless of whether we bring Washington and Puerto Rico in as states or give them Senate representation, we're on track in 15 or 20 years where 30% of the country's population will control 70% of the Senate seats. And conversely, 30% or 70% of the population will only have 30% of the Senate seats. And so places like El Paso come out on the short end of that equation. And so I absolutely agree that it's abhorrent that that people who are affected by the decisions of the elected leaders of this country have no say in many cases in that election. But I wouldn't lose sight of one of the key factors of all of the problems that everybody's been talking about here is this institution that was created as part of the Constitution, in part because of concerns of protecting the interests of slaveholders. And we're still dealing with that today.
Yeah, I think that's a great point for me to end on. I think that there's a lot of good things in the Constitution. I would not have become an individual who teaches constitutional law for a living if I didn't think the document had some extreme value in it. But as we've heard today, there are some issues that the Constitution is not able to respond adequately to. And there are others that the Constitution actually furthers and causes to be worse. And this lack of representation that I think many in the United States are experiencing. As I said earlier, if there's something you want to focus all of your activism on, change the rules about how we count votes. It's not like we couldn't, by the way. The fact that the Senate is directly elected, that's a new development in the history of our country. The Senate was originally chosen by state legislatures. So the fact that we can change the election rules in this country is absolutely a time-honored tradition. So I'm just going to end on that bit of activism. So again, I would like to thank all of you for logging in. Thank you to all of the panelists, to Bob Moore, Dr. Pineda, Dr. Villalobos, Dr. Algara, Angelina Martinez, and Dominique Huerta. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to join us on Constitution Day. And I hope that everyone has an excellent rest of their week, and go vote, and go vote early. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Todd.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. If we can just again have you all please fill out the sorry. I was just saying thank you to the panelists and to everyone that submitted questions, and to Dr. Curry for providing such an informative and educational conversation. If you could all just please fill out the survey that we sent on the chat. And again, if you all want more of these events or more of these activities, please tune into our social media at UTEP SCLC. Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.